opening up diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, immediately initiates a fight for central space. Controlling the center, this reply mirrors white's ambition, setting the stage for a direct confrontation and potential skirmishes in the early middle game. Instantly developing a knight opens lines and pressures black's central pawn, setting the stage for further development and potential kingside activity. Developing a knight to a natural square, nc6 reinforces the central e5 pawn and prepares for further development, a solid response in this classic opening. Instantly challenging black's knight, white aims to disrupt defensive harmony and potentially create early pressure on the queen side. Seeking to challenge the bishop's influence, black immediately probes the kingside's developing pawn structure. Preserving the bishop's diagonal pressure, white maintains tension on the kingside, preparing for future pawn advances and potential piece activity. Initiating an immediate counterattack on white's central pawn, this move disrupts white's planned pawn push and seeks active piece development. Securing the monarch now sets the stage for future queenside operations. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle, this retreat ensures the bishop remains active and ready to defend. Shielding the rook on the e-file prepares for a potential central pawn push, solidifying white's piece coordination and creating a more robust structure. Initiating a pawn thrust into white's bishop's territory, this advance creates immediate spatial tension, forcing a decision on the actively placed light-squared bishop, and potentially opening lines for counterplay on the queen side as black aims to gain more room. Regaining the diagonal is key, as the bishop repositions to a more active role, preparing to influence the queen side and potentially support a future d4 push. Solidifying the center and preparing for pawn advances is the primary goal here, creating a robust pawn chain that defends the king and offers more squares for pieces. Solidifying pawn structure, white prepares to expand on the queen side while maintaining a robust central presence, setting the stage for a slow positional battle where every tempo counts. Castling here secures black's monarch, tucking it safely behind its pawn shield and bringing the rook into potential play along the open e-file. This maneuver signifies a commitment to development and a readiness to engage in the center, subtly challenging white's central pawn structure and eyeing future pawn advances on the queen side. Preventing a pesky knight or bishop from landing on g4 to harass the king side. Black solidifies the pawn chain structure and readies the bishop to contest the active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's queenside initiative and prepare for potential central action. Initiating a central pawn thrust, d4 immediately seeks to break open the position and challenge black's solidly anchored pieces. This bold strike aims to create dynamic imbalances and potentially exploit any hesitations in black's development, turning a seemingly quiet positional game into a sharp tactical battle where control of the d4 square becomes paramount for both sides. Challenging the bishop's dominance and opening the queen side, this capture immediately simplifies the position and disrupts white's planned queenside expansion, forcing a recalculation of pawn structure dynamics. Capturing the bishop on b3 immediately relinquishes white's control over the valuable c-file, a strategic concession that grants black's rook newfound freedom and opens avenues for counterplay. Capturing on d4 initiates a pivotal exchange, loosening white's central pawn structure and opening the e-file for black's rooks. This is a common theme in the Ruy-Lopez when white plays the relatively passive c3 and black seeks to disrupt the center, potentially aiming to establish a strong pawn on d5 later on. Black must now consider how to react to the likely recapture and whether a tactical shot or a positional maneuver is more advantageous to exploit the newly created weaknesses in white's position. The king's safety for both sides also becomes a more immediate concern as the central tension dissipates. Securing the central d-file, this knight leap strategically pressures black's queenside pawn majority and opens lines for further development, hinting at potential pawn pushes or piece maneuvers to exploit the now unsupported c6 knight if black isn't careful. Instantly challenging the knight that occupied the d4 outpost, this capture aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open up the e-file for potential future pressure. Black seeks to equalize piece activity, forcing white to recapture and potentially weaken their kingside pawn cover. Consider the geometrical implications of this exchange. It simplifies the center and begins to transition towards a more open game. Reclaiming the center and solidifying control over the d-file, this pawn advance aims to restrict black's queenside pieces and prepare for potential pawn pushes down the board, all while opening lines for white's rooks. Black boldly challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines and disrupt white's solid setup. This move creates immediate tension on the d4 square, forcing white to decide whether to defend or initiate a pawn exchange. It's a dynamic choice that signals an active approach, seeking to gain counterplay by liberating black's queenside and potentially creating weaknesses for white if they mismanage the ensuing pawn complexities. Clearing the central files for active piece deployment, this capture opens up the d-file for the rook and potentially creates dynamic imbalances, forcing black to reevaluate their pawn structure and the safety of their king amidst the developing complications. Reclaiming the pawn with a clear intent, black decisively addresses the central tension, forcing a reevaluation of pawn structures and opening up the d-file for potential future activity. This exchange simultaneously weakens white's queenside pawn majority by leaving it isolated. Seizing the central initiative, white boldly pushes the pawn forward, creating immediate spatial pressure and challenging black's queen and knight coordination. This advance restricts the defender's pieces and opens up attacking possibilities for white's queen and potentially future pawn thrusts. It's a dynamic decision that injects immediate tactical tension into the position, forcing black to react decisively to maintain their structural integrity and avoid being overwhelmed. The battle for central control has just escalated significantly. That knight's hop to d7 immediately challenges the advanced e5 pawn, creating crucial tension and forcing white to reconsider their forward aggression. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure, forcing a reaction and potentially opening the file for white's rook. This daring thrust into the center creates an immediate spatial imbalance, threatening to unravel white's queenside pawn structure and potentially trap the white queen. Black seizes the initiative, transforming the game into a dynamic struggle where precise piece placement will be paramount. White must now decide whether to defend the queenside or launch a counterattack, risking further pawn weaknesses. Aimed at opening lines towards black's weakly defended monarch, this queen repositioning anticipates a potential kingside attack while subtly pressuring the vulnerable d-pawn. Finally, a breath of fresh air for black's isolated queen's knight, bringing it into the fray and contesting the central tension. This knight's repositioning aims to relieve the pressure on the c-pawn and offers a potential defensive shield for the d-pawn, though it also opens lines that could be exploited. The move subtly suggests a desire to simplify the pawn structure and avoid further positional concessions on the queen side, where white has enjoyed some territorial advantage. It's a reaction that seeks to restore some equilibrium, though vigilance will be required to prevent white from consolidating further gains. Consider how this knight might collaborate with its fellow pieces to create a more harmonious defensive setup, or perhaps even launch a counterthrust once the immediate threats are parried. The rook arrives on the open d-file, a powerful statement of intent aimed directly at black's king and the central structure. A bold maneuver, aiming to disrupt white's central control and create immediate tactical possibilities by attacking the queen and pinning the knight. Redirecting the queen to the queenside, white aims to relieve the pressure on the e4 pawn and potentially establish a stronger defensive posture, acknowledging the risks associated with black's bishop on h4 and the exposed kingside. A daring gamble, sacrificing the bishop for an immediate king attack, hoping the ensuing chaos will overwhelm white's currently solid position and advanced pawns. The king now stands exposed on the f2 square, a glaring target for black's emboldened pieces. While recouping the piece was necessary, this king relocation immediately ignites a dangerous tactical storm, forcing white to be extraordinarily vigilant about pawn weaknesses and open lines. A bold knight sortie, disrupting white's kingside and seizing vital central space, though it does leave the king momentarily exposed, potentially inviting sharp counterplay. Initiating the rook exchange now, after black's king has been forced into the center and their knight sacrificed for piece activity, fundamentally shifts the game's complexion. This action prioritizes simplifying the position under favorable circumstances, aiming to exploit the exposed royal position and the potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure that the recent skirmishes have created. By trading off a piece, white aims to gain a decisive advantage in the ensuing endgame, where the king's safety will be paramount and the pressure on black's remaining pieces will only intensify. The knight sacrifice is a desperate gambit, seeking to disrupt white's imposing rook on the d-file and potentially create a passed pawn on the file with the pawn on c4. While it forces the white king into a more exposed position and eliminates one of white's key defenders, the material deficit remains significant. Black's hope lies in exploiting the awkwardness of the white king and the open diagonals created by this aggressive exchange, aiming for a swift counterattack before white can consolidate their advantage. Opening the h-file prematurely creates a critical weakness around your king. The pawn structure now presents significant structural problems that will likely be exploited in the ensuing endgame, particularly with the open king's position. Securing the open file now presents black with the primary strategic objective in this position. Seizing the open file with the rook offers immediate potential to disrupt black's structure and pressure the isolated pawns. Reclaiming the piece, black initiates a critical sequence to simplify the board and leverage newfound piece activity. This maneuver seeks to neutralize white's central pawn majority and activate the rook on the newly opened file, aiming for a more balanced endgame where the isolated pawns might become less of a liability. The strategic intention is clear: exchange material to alleviate pressure and create counterplay. Initiating the bishop's diagonal offers a potential avenue for activity and asserts control over the long-range diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit any weaknesses around the king. Reclaiming the initiative on the open files is paramount here, as black redirects their rook to a more active position, aiming to pressure white's weakened pawn structure and potentially establish a powerful presence on the d-file. Unleashing the rook's power onto the fifth rank immediately challenges black's material advantage and seeks to exploit the exposed white squares, potentially opening crucial lines towards the enemy king. This maneuver, bringing the rook into the fray on the b-file, aggressively targets white's queenside pawn structure and aims to exploit the discovered attack potential against the lone rook on a5. The rook on a5, now freed from its defensive duties, surveys the board from its elevated perch, aiming to exert pressure along the open files and exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's position. Creating a stronghold for the kingside pawns by advancing f6 offers some protection against white's encroaching pieces on the queenside and central files, while simultaneously preparing potential counterplay through g5 if the opportunity arises. Seeking to dislodge that irritating rook, white prioritizes the open file, but this repositioning might prove a tad slow, potentially allowing black's remaining pieces to consolidate. The rook's journey to d3 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside, but it sacrifices valuable tempo and concedes central control, leaving black's king feeling rather exposed amidst the open lines. Simplifying the material exchange now allows white to consolidate a positional advantage, aiming to exploit the open files and the slight disorganization of black's remaining pieces as the queens depart. The pawn's journey to d3, liberated by the exchange of rooks, now exerts a powerful influence, becoming a potential centerpiece for future play and disrupting any lingering thoughts white might have harbored about central control. Unlocking the semi-open c-file is the immediate priority after the rook exchange. The rook's repositioning to the fourth rank immediately challenges white's pawn structure and prepares to exploit the open lines that will soon materialize. Relocating the monarch to the center amidst the chaos, white prepares for a potential pawn push and aims to activate the king's defensive capabilities. Rethinking the initiative after the queen's sacrifice, black endeavors to activate the rook and create further complications, eyeing the pawn as a potential target. Reclaiming the crucial diagonal for the bishop offers a belated attempt to activate white's least developed piece, though it concedes valuable time and surrenders the initiative further to black's coordinated pieces. Embracing the endgame by reinforcing the kingside pawn structure, black aims to solidify their defenses and potentially prepare for a rook sortie on the open files. Solidifying the kingside is paramount now. Placing this pawn here aims to deny black's rook any foothold on the newly opened g-file, ensuring the king isn't immediately exposed to a kingside assault after the material exchange. Opening a new front on the queenside, the rook's advance aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create dynamic imbalances in the endgame. Re-establishing the bishop's dominion over the long diagonal, this move aims to redeploy its influence actively, particularly towards the kingside where black's monarch might eventually feel exposed if white can secure the open files. Injecting a sudden burst of dynamism to the queenside, black's pawn push challenges white's static piece placement and begins a potential infiltration. Abandoning the pawn on h5 might seem like a concession, but it's a calculated attempt to open lines that could prove more valuable than the immediate material gain. White is sacrificing a pawn to potentially create a passed pawn on the kingside later or to free up the g-file for their rook. This is a strategic gamble, trading a minor piece of material for dynamic possibilities and an attempt to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn structure, which has been the primary defensive asset. Keep a close eye on how black responds to this newfound space and potential for activity on the kingside. Unleashing a desperate, yet potentially useful pawn thrust, black seeks to disrupt white's rook and king coordination, creating an immediate tactical puzzle that forces white's monarch to relocate. This gambit aims to open lines and perhaps even uncover an attacking opportunity on the now exposed white king, while simultaneously trying to solidify black's pawn structure on the queenside by drawing the rook away. The success hinges on whether white can navigate this unexpected complication without compromising their advantage. King's safety is paramount now. Shifting the monarch out of the central crossfire offers a degree of protection while eyeing potential mating nets. Sacrificing material to pry open the king's defenses often leads to a swift victory, and this check is a prime example of that principle. A desperate attempt to sever the opposition's king activity by sacrificing material, hoping to create a new front on the queenside, yet it exposes the king further to the rampant pawn push and limits white's own counterplay. Snatching the pawn on b2 opens up critical pathways for your rook, transforming it into an active participant in the ensuing endgame phase. This opportunistic capture drastically alters the pawn structure and introduces fresh tactical considerations for both sides. Unlocking the rook's potential on the queenside, this maneuver repositions the bishop to exert pressure on the long diagonal and aims to disrupt black's advancing pawn majority, potentially creating weaknesses on the light squares. Unleashing the rook to the second rank immediately creates a significant dynamic, threatening to bisect white's pawn structure on the queenside and potentially exploit the open files. Prioritizing king's safety suddenly becomes paramount as white's monarch ventures out into the open, creating a precarious outpost amidst black's coordinated pieces. Asserting newfound influence on the open file, the rook now aims to dismantle white's structural integrity by targeting isolated pawns. The king boldly ventures into enemy territory, a daring gambit to activate a dormant piece and contest the open lines, potentially transforming the complexion of this material, even endgame through aggressive king play and the creation of dynamic counterplay. Pivoting the monarch towards the queenside aims to consolidate the remaining pawns and potentially create a passed pawn with the king's active involvement, while also preparing for the inevitable pawn pushes that will follow. Reactivating the king by pushing it forward initiates a critical endgame maneuver, aiming to solidify white's central presence and support potential pawn advances. Unleashing the pawn's potential, black seeks to activate this b-pawn, transforming it into a potential unstoppable force as the queens are off the board, and the opposing king seems rather exposed in the center. Shifting the king now aims to centralize it, bringing it closer to the action and potential pawn advances, but exposes it to further checks and complications on the queenside. The rook's journey to the fifth rank offers a dynamic presence, eyeing potential discoveries and creating a pressing threat against white's isolated pawn. The pawn push at h6, while seemingly advancing, actually creates a potential weakness on g6, inviting future infiltration if black can establish a piece there. Given white's current position, a more pressing concern might have been consolidating the central pawn majority or improving the placement of the knight, which currently lacks a clear attacking role. This move, however, seems to prioritize creating space on the kingside, a strategy that might be premature given the active black rook on a5. Consider the consequences of the pawn being attacked or exchanged. Does this push genuinely improve white's position or merely distract from more fundamental strategic goals? It could open up lines for black's bishop or even indirectly support an attack on white's king if it gets too exposed. This strategic retreat, rb5, looks to defend the d-pawn and simultaneously prepare a potential kingside advance. It's a quiet maneuver aimed at reinforcing a key pawn chain and possibly setting up a defensive fortress. The piece reassures its hold on the fourth rank, a position it has been eyeing for some time, and offers a crucial support to the queenside pawn structure. Now the question becomes whether black can leverage this newfound solidity to generate counterplay, or if white's dominant king position will prove too much to overcome. Bringing the monarch closer to the action opens up possibilities for defending pawns and supporting a potential advance in the center, though it also exposes him to discovery threats on the c-file. The rook retreats to a more active position, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the queenside while keeping the pawn structure intact. The monarch retreats, acknowledging the looming threat of the black rook's advanced position, while simultaneously creating a small but vital pocket of safety on the adjacent square. The rook's repositioning to rb7 aims to solidify its presence on the 7th rank, a classic endgame ambition, while simultaneously bolstering the queenside pawn structure against further incursions. Targeting that isolated pawn with the knight creates a crucial decision point for black, potentially leading to a pawn breakthrough or a loss of material if black isn't vigilant. Unlocking a new avenue for the king by nudging it forward, aiming to consolidate its position and potentially support a kingside pawn advance while eyeing any exposed weaknesses in white's pawn structure. Shifting the king's position now, looking to perhaps support the pawn push on the kingside and create some defensive solidity for the monarch. Suddenly, the rook on b6 finds itself in a precarious position, a forgotten pawn guarding its flank against the encroaching knight. Unlocking the knight's potential towards the kingside offers a fresh attacking avenue. Sacrificing a pawn to activate the rook on b6 and create further complications for white's king now feels like the only path forward for black, given the cramped position and the isolated nature of white's own monarch. The white king actively seeks its own safety, navigating the now open diagonals with surprising bravery. The pawn's determined march to the 7th rank, creating a pass threat, immediately disrupts white's piece placement and forces a defensive reaction. Sacrificing the bishop to eliminate the bothersome passed pawn and gain control of the d-file seems like the most direct path to simplify and attempt to salvage this endgame, although the king remains exposed. Seizing the open file with the rook dramatically shifts the endgame's momentum, creating an immediate threat to white's isolated pawns and offering a dynamic counterplay opportunity. The bishop's retreat to f4 is a tactical reevaluation, shifting focus from the kingside to potentially disrupting black's pawn structure or reinforcing a central presence. The rook suddenly retreats to the 1st rank, a surprising repositioning that aims to support the king's central safety and perhaps prepare for a future knight sortie to d3 or c4, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Recapturing with the knight on e4 creates a significant advantage by placing the piece on a commanding central square, poised to exploit black's exposed king and weak pawn structure. Embracing the looming pawn march, black's king strategically sidesteps the immediate threat, seeking refuge behind its still active rook on the adjacent file. The knight's repositioning aims to secure the d-pawn's advance, potentially creating a passed pawn and disrupting black's defensive structure. The king is suddenly exposed to a relentless barrage of checks, forcing it to navigate a dangerous maze as the passed pawn continues its perilous march towards promotion. This repositioning of the king to c2 aims to defend the pawn on b3, while simultaneously preparing to support the advance of the remaining pawns on the queen side, creating a powerful passed pawn. The rook's activation down the first rank creates an immediate threat to the white king, forcing a reactive response and potentially disrupting white's carefully orchestrated pawn structure. The white king seeks refuge from the relentless pressure, aiming to consolidate its position on the queen side, while the rook on a1 prepares to participate in the defense. The rook on a3 now establishes an active outpost, aiming to penetrate white's queen side and disrupt any attempt at pawn consolidation there. Seizing the central pawn with the knight now forces a pawn storm to be dealt with individually. A swift rook pivot to the c-file reclaims some dynamic potential, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats along the back rank if white's king remains exposed. A bold repositioning of the knight, aiming to block the d-file now that the rook has been evicted, and perhaps prepare a later maneuver to the king side if the opportunity arises. The rook's relocation to the third rank now pressures the white king's defense and sets up a potential breakthrough on the queen side, aiming to exploit the d-pawn's advanced position. Reclaiming the knight's central dominion presents a calculated risk, as its repositioning may expose the king side once more to potential harassment, forcing a delicate balance between immediate tactical gains and long-term structural integrity. Unleashing the rook to its most active file creates immediate pressure along the open d-file, aiming to dislodge the knight and potentially infiltrate white's territory. Snatching that pawn is a bold move, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create an open file for your rook. The pawn on f5 aims to solidify black's central presence, seeking to anchor the king for an eventual advance or to disrupt white's potential pawn thrusts. Clearing the d-file opens a direct path for your rook, aiming to infiltrate black's weakened back ranks and exploit the isolated pawn structure. Reactivating the rook to challenge the open file offers a glimmer of hope, aiming to disrupt white's neatly stacked pieces. This repositioning of the king aims to secure it from further threats and prepare for potential pawn pushes, while also acknowledging the blocked nature of the queen side. Bringing the monarch into the fray, this audacious maneuver on the sixth rank seeks to actively participate in the endgame's unfolding drama, potentially creating opportunities for pawn promotion, or exploiting any defensive weaknesses that might arise from white's now somewhat scattered forces. The white king bravely ventures forward, aiming to disrupt the black rook's activity and solidify its presence on the queen side. The black king's bold excursion towards the center, aiming to participate in the endgame action, creates both opportunities and significant risks that require careful navigation. The knight's sudden check forces black's king into an even more precarious central position, a stark contrast to the safety it enjoyed earlier, and now the knight stands poised to exploit any weakness. The king's perilous dance towards the center continues, exposing him to potential checks that could unravel black's gains, a stark reminder of the delicate balance in this endgame. Unleashing the knight to a dominant outpost on e6, seeking to pin down the rook and disrupt black's already precarious pawn structure. The king ventures out, seeking counterplay amidst a tangle of pieces, but it's a gamble on an exposed flank, potentially inviting white's knight into a more dominant central position. Shifting the knight to the f8 square sets up a potential regrouping, aiming to solidify the king's safety behind its pawns and prepare for future maneuvers.